Behind every legendary musician who changed the world, there's always a story about the artist who inspired them first. Paul McCartney, the genius who helped create the Beatles and revolutionize popular music forever, didn't just appear out of nowhere with his incredible talent. He was shaped and molded by the sounds that came before him, the voices that moved him, and the musicians who showed him what was possible. From Little Richard's wild, screaming vocals that seemed to come from another planet, to Buddy Holly's songwriting that proved musicians could create their own material, McCartney studied these artists with deep respect and genuine love. He absorbed everything they had to offer like a sponge. He once said that Little Richard taught him everything he knows about performing, and that's not an exaggeration at all. While Buddy Holly showed him that you didn't need to wait for someone else to write your songs, you could do it yourself if you had the courage and the talent. These influences, these musical heroes, helped shape McCartney into one of music's greatest legends, someone whose impact continues to this day. Today, we're going to explore the bands and artists that made Paul McCartney the musician that millions of people around the world have come to love and admire. Coming in at number 10 are the Everly Brothers, the duo that McCartney once called the greatest band to ever exist. That's high praise coming from someone like Paul McCartney. Brothers Don and Phil Everly completely shaped how McCartney understood harmony and songwriting in those early formative years. When McCartney and John Lennon first heard songs like All I Have to Do Is Dream back in 1958, it genuinely changed everything for them as young aspiring musicians. McCartney said the biggest influence on him and Lennon during those early days was absolutely the Everly Brothers, and they desperately wanted to be just like them. The beautiful harmonies created by two male voices singing together showed them something completely new and exciting. When the young songwriters started creating music together in their bedrooms and at school, McCartney would pretend to be Phil while Lennon played the role of Don. They studied every harmony, every vocal inflection, every subtle detail. Years later, in 1984, when the Everly Brothers reunited after a painful breakup, McCartney wrote them a comeback song called On the Wings of a Nightingale as his gift to them. When Phil Everly died in 2014, McCartney wrote a beautiful tribute saying he would always love him for giving him the sweetest musical memories of his entire life. At number 9 is Chuck Berry, the guitar legend and storyteller. The man McCartney called a magician who somehow created music that was exotic yet completely normal at the same time. When the Beatles first heard that distinctive guitar intro to Sweet Little 16, they instantly became devoted fans. McCartney said Berry's lyrics were more like poetry than typical song lyrics, especially in classics like Johnny B. Goode and Maybelline. He was a natural-born poet, according to Paul. Berry taught the Beatles so many musical lessons that led them into a dream world of rock and roll possibilities. The band covered multiple Berry songs during their career, including rock and roll music Sweet Little 16 and Johnny B. Goode. During their early years performing in clubs, McCartney even borrowed the bass line directly from Berry's I'm Talking About You and used it for the Beatles classic I Saw Her Standing There. He played exactly the same notes and said it fit the new song perfectly. McCartney actually met Berry in his hometown of St. Louis when he played there on tour, and he called it a memory he would cherish forever. Berry was one of rock and roll's absolute greatest legends, and McCartney admitted it was completely impossible to sum up what he meant to all the young guys growing up in Liverpool dreaming of making music. Number 8 brings us to Fats Domino, the New Orleans piano legend who absolutely thrilled McCartney and the Beatles during their early Liverpool days. Songs like Ain't That a Shame, Blueberry Hill, and I'm in Love Again introduced them to the incredible sounds of New Orleans rock and roll for the first time. McCartney said Domino's distinctive voice, his piano playing style, and his overall musical approach was a huge influence on the Beatles' sound. The band was genuinely excited to meet Domino once in his hometown of New Orleans back in 1964 during their American tour. McCartney remembered with amusement that Domino was wearing this huge star-spangled diamond watch, which was their very first encounter with what we now casually call bling. His appearance in the classic film, The Girl Can't Help It, was truly magnificent to them as young fans. McCartney was so deeply influenced by Domino's style that when he sat down to write Lady Madonna in 1968, he found himself naturally singing a Fats Domino impression. The boogie-woogie piano style took his voice to a very odd and distinctive place. Domino later covered the song himself, making it his last charting single and completing this beautiful circle of mutual musical respect between the two artists. Coming in at number 7 is Smokey Robinson, the Motown legend that McCartney once said was like God in the Beatles' eyes. This is honestly one of the highest compliments McCartney ever gave to another artist in his entire career. Robinson's impossibly smooth vocals and brilliant songwriting, with the miracles deeply touched all 4 Beatles members in profound ways. The band showed their genuine love and respect by covering Robinson's song You Really Got a Hold on Me for their album with the Beatles. John Lennon wrote Not a Second Time specifically trying to sound like Smokey Robinson, while George Harrison later released a solo song called Pure Smokey as his personal tribute to the singer. Robinson actually met the Beatles before they became internationally famous when they were still just playing in a Liverpool club. He was genuinely flattered that John Lennon already knew so much about his music and was asking him detailed questions about Miracle songs. Robinson said he loved that the Beatles were the first really popular white band who came right out publicly and said they grew up influenced by black music and Motown. The feeling of respect between them was completely mutual and created a lasting friendship that continued for decades. At number 6 is Carl Perkins, the king of rockabilly, who wrote the absolute classic Blue Suede Shoes. McCartney once made this powerful statement about Perkins, saying that if there were no Carl Perkins, there would be no Beatles. This really shows just how important this Tennessee musician was to the band's entire development and sound. The Beatles covered several Perkins songs during their early years, including Matchbox, Honey Don't, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. McCartney used to perform Lend Me Your Comb regularly in the early Beatles days. When the Beatles toured Britain with Chuck Berry in 1964, they spent the very last night of the tour sitting on the floor with Perkins, sharing stories, playing guitar together, and singing songs late into the night. McCartney said Carl was still the legendary guy who wrote Blue Suede Shoes and could never do any wrong in his eyes. In 1981, McCartney invited Perkins to record the song Get It for his album Tug of War. Years later, in 1993, Perkins showed up unexpectedly at McCartney's backstage door after a concert in Memphis with his guitar in hand. The two men spent an entire hour just playing all the rockabilly songs they both loved. McCartney's publishing company still owns the rights to Perkins' songs today as a testament to his respect. Coming in at number 5 is Roy Orbison, the man with the powerful operatic voice and those iconic dark sunglasses who became one of the Beatles' greatest musical idols. When Brian Epstein first asked Orbison to tour England with the Beatles in 1963, Orbison actually responded by asking what's a Beatle because he genuinely had no idea how popular they were becoming. The tour created this friendly but intense competition between the two acts. McCartney remembered how Orbison would sit quietly at the back of the tour bus writing incredible songs like Pretty Woman, and it would make the Beatles genuinely jealous of his talent. McCartney said they would tell him the song was great to his face, but inside they would be thinking they desperately needed to have something just as good themselves. This healthy competition actually inspired McCartney to write classics like All My Loving on that same tour bus. John Lennon originally wrote Please Please Me as this slow, dreary ballad that sounded like a Roy Orbison song. Producer George Martin made them speed it up dramatically, and it became their first real hit. McCartney later called their time touring with Orbison a genuinely historic moment in music. The Beatles were actually scared to perform after him because he was so incredibly powerful on stage, standing completely still like a marble statue while hitting these incredible high notes that seemed impossible. At number 4 are the Beach Boys, and specifically the genius of Brian Wilson, whose groundbreaking album Pet Sounds changed absolutely everything for the Beatles. When McCartney first heard Pet Sounds in 1966, he genuinely thought it was the album of all time, and he wondered what the hell the Beatles were possibly going to do next to compete. He said the album completely blew him out of the water. McCartney was so deeply impressed that he later bought copies of Pet Sounds for each of his kids specifically for their education in life. He truly believed nobody was properly educated musically until they had heard that album front to back. The melodic bass lines on Pet Sounds particularly inspired McCartney to write much more melodic and creative bass parts for the Beatles going forward. McCartney called God Only Knows the greatest song ever written, which is his personal favorite Beach Boys song. It directly inspired him to write Here, There, and Everywhere using Beach Boys style harmonies in the introduction. The friendly rivalry between the two bands pushed both groups to absolute greatness. The Beatles' Rubber Soul inspired Pet Sounds, which then inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in this beautiful creative cycle. When McCartney performed God Only Knows Live with Brian Wilson many years later, he actually broke down crying during soundcheck because the song was just so emotional for him. He genuinely loved Wilson and felt privileged to be around his bright, shining creative light. Taking the number 3 spot is Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll who changed absolutely everything for young Paul McCartney. When McCartney first heard Heartbreak Hotel in 1956, he had to go to a record shop in Liverpool and listen to it through headphones in a little booth. It was this magical, life-changing moment for him, the beginning of an entire era. McCartney said Elvis was so incredibly hot and cool, and they were all completely in love with him. McCartney started seeing pictures of Elvis everywhere, and that completely pulled him away from his academic path at school. He said these tingles started going up and down his spine whenever he heard Elvis, and all the academic things he was supposed to care about were just forgotten. McCartney admitted he doubts very much if the Beatles would have ever happened if it was not for Elvis showing them the way. The Beatles finally met Elvis at his home in Los Angeles in 1965, which was this incredible moment. McCartney remembered that Elvis was really into discussing the bass guitar, which gave them a great conversation piece and broke the ice. Elvis was talkative, friendly, and just a little bit shy in person. Years later, in 2013, McCartney visited Graceland for the very first time and placed a guitar pick on Elvis's grave so he could play music in heaven. At number 2 is James Brown, the godfather of soul, who McCartney called absolutely fantastic. In a 2003 interview, McCartney honestly admitted that if you stack the Beatles up against James Brown record for record, Brown was definitely hotter musically because he was James Brown. McCartney respected his incredible talent even while defending the Beatles' own legacy. Brown's influence on McCartney's bass playing was absolutely huge and undeniable. McCartney absorbed musical elements from Brown's songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which helped him develop much more spontaneous and melodic bass lines. The American soul music coming from artists like Brown fascinated McCartney and the entire Beatles throughout the mid-1960s. McCartney even used Brown as direct inspiration while recording in the studio. When working on songs, he would sometimes think to himself that he should sing it like James Brown might approach it. He had these little mental images of Brown during recording sessions. McCartney said there was something about Brown's incredible showmanship and pure soul that was completely impossible to match. Coming in at number 1 is Little Richard, the screaming pioneer of rock and roll who taught McCartney everything he knows about performing. When Little Richard came screaming into McCartney's life as a teenager with explosive songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly, everything changed for young Paul. McCartney said he genuinely owed a lot of what he does musically to Little Richard and his wild style, and Richard knew it too. Little Richard would proudly say he taught Paul everything he knows, and McCartney admitted Richard was absolutely right about that. In the early days of the Beatles, they actually played shows with Richard in Hamburg and got to know him personally backstage. Richard would generously let them hang out in his dressing room, and they witnessed his elaborate pre-show rituals. McCartney watched him put his head under a towel over steaming hot water, then suddenly lift his head dramatically to the mirror and announce he couldn't help it because he was so beautiful. And honestly, he was beautiful. Little Richard taught McCartney his distinctive vocal techniques and showed him how to scream with real power and genuine emotion. McCartney even adopted Richard's pre-show ritual of steaming his face before performances. When Richard died in 2020, McCartney thanked him publicly for everything he taught and the kindness he showed by letting him be his friend. From Little Richard's wild screams to the Beach Boys' beautiful harmonies, these 10 artists shaped Paul McCartney into the absolute legend we know and love today.